This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news compiled in the early hours of Saturday the 19th of November. I'm Jackie Lenner with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service news today. Coming up, the World Health Organization has declared the Zika emergency is now over.
The Zika virus and associated complications remain a significant public health challenge, but it no longer represents a public health emergency of international concern.
The Trump cabinet is taking shape. Among the announcements, controversial Senator Jeff Sessions for the post of Attorney General.
From my experience and my knowledge of Jeff Sessions, he is not a racist, he is not a bigoted individual.
The Syrian city of Aleppo has suffered its heaviest bombardment for years.
It was a steady crescendo rising, and last night it was relentless all night long. It was like rolling thunder.
And a $450 million bill to future-proof Queen Elizabeth's London residence, Buckingham Palace. But first, back in February, the World Health Organization declared the mosquito-borne Zika virus an international medical emergency. Now the WHO has lifted that declaration. The infection has been linked to severe birth defects in almost 30 countries. These include microcephaly, where babies were born with abnormally small heads and restricted brain development. The head of the WHO Emergency Committee, Dr. David Heyman, warned, though, that Zika still posed what he called a significant and enduring threat.
Because research has now demonstrated that the Zika virus infection and microcephaly are associated, the committee felt that what is best now is a very robust technical response to the virus, and that would require work within WHO. As a result, the Emergency Committee felt that the Zika virus and associated complications remain a significant and an enduring public health challenge requiring intense action within WHO, but it no longer represents a public health emergency of international concern.
Our global health correspondent is Tulip Mazumdar.
Well, they've, of course, been keeping tabs on this very closely, this emergency committee, since sort of the start of the year. In February, they announced an international public health emergency, and they've met, this will be the fifth time they've met since then. And what they've said, as you heard Dr. David Heyman say there, that this is no longer an emergency that needs an immediate response to find out what's going on, which is what happened in February. This outbreak now needs to be seen as a long-term situation that needs a long-term plan. Their message in that meeting earlier today was that Zika is here to stay. But we're in a situation now where the world knows a lot more about what to expect. If you think back to February time, where we saw this explosion of cases of Zika in Brazil, at that time you also saw the number of cases of children being born with microcephaly, brain damage, rising as well. But what they didn't know is whether those two things were linked. They really had very little information about what was going on. They've now established that link. They know a fair bit about how Zika works and how crucially it affects pregnant women, and now they're saying instead of doing very quick research to get more information on exactly what's going on, we've got a fair idea of what's going on, now let's make a long-term plan, because this is a significant and enduring threat, is how they described it, and it needs to be dealt with in a long-term way.
And what does that mean for women who are pregnant or who want to be pregnant? Is the advice still the same?
The advice is still the same. The World Health Organization reiterated that pregnant women or women who think they might become pregnant very soon, they're advising them not to go to Zika-hit countries or areas in those countries where Zika is present for the time being. There's also the threat of it being passed human to human through sex, and so the advice there is also people travelling to these countries to wear protection or abstain 6 months after they get back from Zika-hit areas. So in many ways, and again this was acknowledged in the meeting, that this is still new territory. There is still a lot more to find out about this virus, but we do know a lot more than we did even 6 months ago, and therefore this needs to be dealt with in a slightly different way.
Our global health correspondent, Tulip Mazumdar. The US President-elect Donald Trump has offered key posts in his cabinet to controversial conservative Republicans. He's asked the Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, who was rejected as a federal judge in the 1980s because of racially charged comments, to be Attorney General. Ron Christie is a Republican strategist, and he denies Mr. Sessions is a racist.
I respect Senator Jeff Sessions from Alabama very much. He was put forth to be a federal district court judge back in the 80s. He was rejected by the Senate Judiciary Committee over alleged racial insensitive remarks that he had made. Mr. Sessions denies that he'd ever made those comments and said that they were a vicious smear. From my experience and my knowledge of Jeff Sessions, he is not a racist. He is not a bigoted individual.
Here's a flavour of opinion in New York.
Well, I think we're in trouble. I think we're in a whole lot of trouble. It's going to be a nightmare.
Just give the man a chance. And that's all you can do is give him a chance.
Mr. Trump has also appointed a man linked to the conservative Tea Party movement to be director of the CIA. The job of National Security Advisor has been offered to a retired general who recently tweeted that fear of Muslims was rational. Our correspondent Nick Bryant reports from New York on the makeup of a very different administration from the one it's replacing.
From Trump Tower, the White House in waiting, have come a flurry of appointments as President-elect Trump continues to staff his incoming administration, and his picks have been white male conservatives with controversial pasts. As National Security Advisor, he selected General Michael Flynn, a retired intelligence officer whose views on Muslims have been accused of being Islamophobic. He's claimed that Sharia law is spreading across America, a blatant falsehood. He tweeted earlier this year that fear of Muslims is rational. And he also delivered a speech in the summer likening the world's second largest religion to a malignant cancer.
Islam is a political ideology. It definitely hides behind this notion of it being a religion. And it's like a malignant cancer, though, in this case.
Donald Trump's choice of Attorney General is just as controversial. He's picked Senator Jeff Sessions from the deep south state of Alabama, who had to withdraw from consideration for a federal judgeship in the mid-1980s after being accused of making racist comments. Former colleagues testified before Congress that Mr. Sessions had said the Ku Klux Klan was fine until he found out its members smoked marijuana. He allegedly referred to an African-American prosecutor as boy and called leading civil rights groups un-American. Senator Sessions claims these allegations are untrue. The pick for CIA director is the Republican Congressman James Pompeo, a fierce critic of the Iranian nuclear deal negotiated by the Obama administration. He's called for the United States to walk away from that agreement. This morning, the president-elect spoke with the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg and agreed on the enduring importance of the Western military alliance, something he seemed to question during the campaign. And this weekend he's expected to meet Mitt Romney, the former Republican presidential nominee, who's been a strident critic of the billionaire. There's speculation that Mr. Romney could become the next U.S. Secretary of State. But these early appointments indicate sharp and dramatic shifts in U.S. foreign and domestic policy. Donald Trump won this election by taking hardline stances, and many of his supporters will be delighted that the staffing of the new administration is so far reflecting those hardline views.
Nick Bryant in New York. Well, during his campaign for the presidency, Donald Trump said he would remove restrictions on oil and gas companies. But in a move that could frustrate his plans, at least for some time, President Obama has removed the Arctic from the areas that had been included in a 5-year energy plan. Rachel Waldholtz is an energy reporter for Alaska Public Media in Anchorage, and she began by explaining what had been proposed.
The federal government plans for offshore oil and gas leasing in these 5-year cycles, and they had, in an earlier draft this spring, included 2 lease sales, one in the Chukchi and one in the Beaufort Seas. So those are both off Alaska's northern coast. But the final plan was released this morning, and they had removed those Arctic lease sales.
And if Mr. Trump wants to reverse that decision, that the drilling is not going to go ahead there, how straightforward is that?
Yeah, it's not an easy process. If a Trump administration wants to add the Arctic back in and open up new areas for oil and gas exploration, they'd basically have to go through this complex regulatory process and issue a whole new plan. You know, it's estimated that would take, a minimum of a year, maybe as much as 3 years. So it's likely that this plan will stand at least for a while.
And just explain to us, how important is the fossil fuel industry to Alaska, and what sort of reaction is there to Mr. Obama's decision?
Well, there were certainly national environmental groups and many environmental groups here in Alaska were thrilled with the decision. You know, they think the Arctic is way too risky. There's the potential for an oil spill, and of course the impact on climate change of that oil and gas being extracted. But locally, industry groups in Alaska and Alaska elected officials are furious. There was a feeling that offshore oil and gas drilling would be really good for Alaska's economy. And so local groups have reacted. I think our U.S. Senator said she was infuriated. And that is a lot of the reaction here in the state.
Rachel Waldholtz. Rescue workers in the Syrian city of Aleppo say that the fourth day of aerial bombardment they faced is the heaviest for years. Margaret Evans is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's Europe correspondent, and she left government-held Western Aleppo on Friday morning, having been there for 5 days. So what was it like?
Pretty bad. I mean, just on the 4 days of bombing that, we could hear from Western Aleppo, it was a steady crescendo rising. And last night, it was relentless all night long. It wasn't just, the occasional sound of an airstrike and some mortar shells. It really was quite constant. It was like rolling thunder. It began in the morning, bit of a pause in the afternoon. And then last night, again, heavy, heavy, heavy. We were up filing until 3 or 4 in the morning, and it was still going on.
Could you tell whether these were Russian or Syrian planes?
No, very difficult. I mean, quite often they are flying above your sight line. The couple of times that I did see them come flying low over, I mean, I'm not, an expert on aircraft and was with someone who had a better idea than I. We had a hard time telling. They would fire flares to try to attract any kind of aircraft fire away from the jets, obviously, but difficult to tell. Obviously, the activists that we communicate with on the other side said that they did believe that they were, and some people suggest that because it was so relentless and so constant, especially yesterday, Thursday, that they didn't think that the Syrian army was capable of sustaining that kind of activity, but no way of confirming that from my point of view.
And when you spoke to people on the other side, or indeed in West Aleppo, did you get information about ground forces moving in as well?
No, and we, though, of course, were accompanied constantly by a net of government minders, so we weren't really able to move freely. I don't think people would have spoken to us freely. What we did see earlier in the week when we drove up from Damascus to Aleppo, we went through 30 checkpoints along the way. We did see a lot of Russian troop activity going up from Homs north to Aleppo. We did also see some reinforcements, some busloads of Syrian soldiers saying goodbye to their families. It looked like they were preparing to go away for a period of time.
Right, and did you get a sense of where this is headed now, what you think is going to be happening, let's say, in the period before the end of the year?
Well, we did an interview with an MP from Aleppo, of course, so on the government side of things, who insisted that, this wasn't going to be a matter of months, it would be weeks. So that's the government line. From what we were seeing in the places that we were able to get to, and some of them were quite close to areas that just taken, within the last 5 to 7 days, this is still a very hot line. It's shifting back and forth. The besieged areas in the center of town, one thing. It was very difficult to get a sense of what was happening there. People would say that they're being held and used as human shields. People on the inside say that's not true, but, you don't really know who you're talking to all the time. So difficult to say, but, as you know very well, this is a conflict that has moved back and forth again. So hard to predict. I would say that the regime and the Syrian army folks that we talk to are sounding very, very confident and not as worried about having a journalist close to that front line as they might have been in the past.
You've been there for 5 days. Just the last question to you. What surprised you in Aleppo or in Syria generally? What weren't you expecting?
Well, I guess the tale of two cities in a way. Just the way that the mood of the city in the west shifted ever so slightly when the airstrikes began again. That sense of people living right next to something that quite terrible is going on that they can hear constantly, and yet a street or two over from this eerie front line where people were picking their way carefully and, living behind sniper sheets, shielding them from people on the other side. there's the falafel seller. It's that strange juxtaposition of life and conflict so close together.
Margaret Evans speaking to Owen Bennett-Jones. You're listening to Global News, the best stories, interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. Still to come, ballet diplomacy.
It's such a beautiful thing to be here and to really feel like, I connect with everyone here. And again, that even though we don't speak the same language, we speak the same language.
Cuba Ballet Festival reflects diplomatic pas de deux with the US. Remember that every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main news stories and why they matter. That's In the World This Week with Johnny Diamond. It's broadcast on Saturdays and Sundays, and you can also download it from our website. In Malawi, an HIV-positive man who had admitted having sex with more than 100 women and young girls as part of traditional cleansing ceremonies has been convicted of harmful cultural practices. The case of Eric Anviva was the first of its kind in the country. Emma Kalia from the Malawi Human Rights Resource Centre told the BBC he wasn't the only man taking part in such practices.
The issue is not only about Aniva. They have several others that are doing similar, and they're getting away with impunity. So that's the problem that I have, because they will go undercover, and they will still continue doing the same things, but in a very secretive way. But with him, he was staying in the community, and that community knew what he was doing.
Our Southern Africa correspondent Karen Allen told us how Eric Anviva came to be arrested.
Eric Anviva had done an interview with a BBC journalist in which he disclosed that he'd had unprotected sex. He was HIV positive. He knew he was HIV positive since 2012. Unprotected sex with girls as young as 12 as part of a cultural practice in the case of young girls to initiate them into adulthood, and in the case of widows, and that's what this case was specifically about, so grown women who've been widowed, to prepare them and to prepare their husbands for the afterlife. He was arrested in July under presidential orders for contravening gender laws in Malawi. He was convicted of harmful cultural practices, and it was based on the testimony of two women who say that he was paid to have sex with them as newly bereaved widows. And it was determined that that was a violation of the law. It's completely split opinion because some people say in Malawi this is encroachment of the state in deeply held traditions. Other people say that what this man did amounted to abuse and he should be punished. And certainly that's the view that the court took today.
And he has been convicted, so what sort of sentence might he expect?
I've heard the possibility of 5 years, maybe more, but this is uncharted territory. He will be sentenced on the 22nd of November, and I'm sure that the controversy will continue given the fact that he has divided opinion, and we're just not sure how widespread this cultural practice is.
Finally, Karen, he is HIV positive. Is there any word on how many of the women he had unprotected sex with might have been infected?
He says he's had sex with 104 people. That's not necessarily the case that all 104 automatically got infected. And as you can imagine, it's such a sensitive case. Many of the girls and young women have not come forward. So I think that gives you a sense. We simply don't know. But Malawi still has very high HIV rates. And certainly the president has been credited by a number of agencies of trying to do what he can to slowly change that around.
Our Southern Africa correspondent Karen Allen. This week, the prima ballerina of the American Ballet Theatre, Misty Copeland, is in Havana as a special envoy of the State Department, attending workshops and ballet classes. Under President Obama, there's been a dramatic change in the once frosty relationship between the US and communist Cuba. The thaw has gone far beyond ballet and the arts. The president-elect Donald Trump has both supported and opposed President Obama's Cuban policy. So, what will his relationship with Havana be like? Will Grant reports from Havana.
It could perhaps be best described as ballet diplomacy. Dancers from Argentina to South Korea being taken through their stretches and bar exercises by a Cuban choreographer. US-Cuba relations have been warming up too, for almost 2 years now. In fact, 7 of the 17 dance companies that came to Havana for the annual ballet festival this month were American. Among them, Ballet West from Utah, who wanted to see for themselves the communist-run island's unique style and teaching methods. It is a long way from Salt Lake City, But the dancers say it's not such a huge leap culturally.
Dance and art is, at its core, communication. We've been communicating with dance and with art since before we had language as humankind.
Christopher Rood is Ballet West's principal dancer. It may be his first visit to Cuba, but he says he found an immediate connection with his Cuban counterparts.
I don't speak any Spanish, but the language of ballet is understood for every dancer. I think it's quite a grand example of how we can share and collaborate and be together, you know, across all political boundaries and things like that.
Yet despite the bilateral goodwill shown over the past couple of years, the future between the old foes suddenly seems very uncertain again. Put it this way, if President Obama opted to ask Cuba to dance after years waiting in the wings, Donald Trump's victory has thrown the entire pas de deux into question.
The post-electoral confusion coincides with a visit to Cuba by Misty Copeland, principal dancer with the renowned American Ballet Theatre and the first African-American to be promoted to the role. She's come to Havana as the State Department's special envoy for sports and culture, and given the nervousness in Cuba over what a Trump presidency might bring, she was a welcome face of the outgoing administration.
It's also, I think, just incredible as a Black American woman to come here and to see people who look like me doing classical ballet when, you know, it's such a stigma in the classical ballet world, you know, to look a certain way. So it's such a beautiful thing to be here and to really feel like, you know, I connect with everyone here. And again, that even though we don't speak the same language, we speak the same language.
Still, collaboration in ballet long predates President Obama's overtures to Cuba. In attendance at the festival's closing gala was the island's original prima ballerina, Alicia Alonso. Now 94 years old, she performed in the United States several times during her illustrious career and at the height of the Cold War. Today's leading Cuban ballet dancer, Viense Valdez, says the recent cultural exchanges with the US have been mutually beneficial.
We can have more experience, they can have more experience. Here the audience is amazing. Everybody can show what they can do, but also they can also learn. We can learn, we can appreciate how the ballet is working outside Cuba. So that's help us, because otherwise we are only dancing for us.
Valdez's performances in Giselle and Don Quixote established her as a household name in Cuba. As the National Ballet Company's prima ballerina, she firmly believes culture will overcome political hostility, whoever's in the White House.
We can do more. We can bring North American choreographers to choreograph in Cuba, exchange ballets, exchange productions, so they can bring materials to do a beautiful ballet here, and then we can bring the dancers.
During her visit to Cuba, Michelle Obama took particular interest in Cuban dance, meeting young dancers and musicians in Havana. Whether her successor as First Lady, born in a communist nation herself of course, also comes to Cuba for the ballet, largely depends on her husband's foreign policy. Either way, dancers on both sides of the Florida Straits insist the curtain isn't coming down on this new friendship just yet.
No.
Bill Grant in Havana. A noisy wedding in Haryana in northern India, and if you listen carefully, you can hear gunshots. They weren't fired in anger, but in celebration. Unfortunately, the groom's aunt was killed and 3 of his relatives critically wounded. The woman who fired the shots has handed herself into the police 3 days after the event. Shivani Kohak of BBC Hindi gave us more details about Sadhvi Deva Thakur.
Sadhvi Deva Thakur is basically someone who's assumed the status of being a holy woman, and now she has a cult following. She's sort of a local celebrity in her area, but she's also very publicity crazy. So she dresses up in a certain way, always in saffron robes. She's wearing a lot of gold ornaments, but she has a fascination for guns. So she's always pictured with a double-barrel gun, and she's posing around with them. She carries guards around her. So it's quite a contrast if you look at it. She's supposed to be a holy woman, but she likes to be seen with guns.
And she was invited, presumably, to this wedding. Tell us what happened then.
It happened this Tuesday. She was a guest at the wedding along with her guards. And from what we hear from the media reports in India is that she went up to the stage, requested a DJ for a certain song, and then started firing shots. But the firing, I watched the video, and the firing went on and on and on. And then suddenly there was chaos, and the groom's aunt was killed, and 3 other people were very seriously injured.
Just to step back for a minute, how often do you see celebratory gunfire at a wedding?
Traditionally, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, parts of North India, it was a part of the ceremony, sort of a show of display of wealth, their affluence, and a replacement to fireworks, really. But in the last few years, you've seen that the more powerful you are, the more the gunfire and the bigger the noise, and that is meant to be a good wedding, especially in the political circles or the affluent circles. But sadly, there are a few incidents in the last few years which have also made the government to crack down on it. Now it is legally required to report any celebratory gunfire if it takes place.
Now, right after this incident, this woman disappeared, but she's now handed herself in along with her guards, I gather. What's going to happen next?
It could be a case of a long drawn-out court case where it's hard to prove who actually shot the fatal gunshots. So this case might go on, and it's quite hard to say right now what will come out of it.
And just finally, you said that this woman, she's, I mean, as you say, only in her 20s, but she has something of a cult following. Are people still supporting her?
On social media, there's no chat around it, but there is a lot of sharing of the video.
Shivani Kohok of BBC Hindi. Here in Britain, it's been announced that Queen Elizabeth's official London residence, Buckingham Palace, is to have refurbishment, which will cost around $450 million. The work, which will go before Parliament for approval, will involve the replacement of the palace's wiring, heating and plumbing. Officials say the repairs are needed to avoid catastrophic problems, but critics of the royal family have questioned whether the spending can be justified during a time of austerity. Here's our royal correspondent, Sarah Campbell.
The official London residence of the Queen, a building which palace officials described today as part of the nation's DNA, is now in a dangerous state of disrepair. It contains more than 100 miles of electric cabling and 20 miles of heating pipes, along with 6,500 plug sockets and 5,000 light fittings. Little has been replaced since the 1950s, leaving the palace at risk of fire or flood damage on a catastrophic scale, according to an independent assessment. The plan is to spread the refurbishments over 10 years. The taxpayer will fund the work through a 66% increase in the annual Treasury payments to the Queen, known as the Sovereign Grant. Graham Smith is from the anti-monarchy group Republic.
I think it's pretty appalling that the palace have gone yet again to the taxpayer to ask for more money. Everybody else is suffering huge cuts, public services, welfare, benefits and so on. 38% increase on royal funding over the last 5 years, and yet they're demanding even more.
Some MPs have also questioned the amount of public money to be used. However, Duncan Wilson from Heritage England, which will be involved in approving the works, says the palace is a special case.
If any building deserves the title iconic and representing the UK to the world outside, it must be Buckingham Palace. So surely we need to protect it for future generations and do that properly.
The Queen is completely supportive of the plan, say palace officials, and although she won't have to move out when the builders move in, she is prepared to move rooms to accommodate them. With 775 to choose from, Her Majesty should be able to avoid the noise.
That was Sarah Campbell, and that's it from us for now. I'm off to help the Queen strip her wallpaper, but Emilio Sampedro will be here with an updated version of the Global News podcast tomorrow. If you'd like to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, do please send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Jackie Leonard, and until next time, goodbye.